You really think you've earned the right to touch that rifle? The question cracked across the Marine rifle range with enough contempt to turn heads long before the echo faded into the warm Carolina afternoon. Conversation stopped. Boots settled into the gravel. A dozen Marines in fresh camouflage turned toward the source of the commotion, expecting to see another overconfident recruit being corrected. Instead, they found an old man standing quietly at the equipment counter. Thomas Walker was 82 years old. His white hair peeked from beneath a faded ball cap, and his weathered denim jacket hung loosely over broad shoulders that time had bent but never truly defeated. His jeans were clean, his boots were polished from habit rather than vanity, and his hands rested calmly on the wooden counter as though he had stood at places like this his entire life. He showed no sign of embarrassment, no trace of anger. He simply waited. Behind the counter, Corporal Ethan Brooks folded his arms across his chest and let out a laugh loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Sir, these rifles aren't museum displays, and this isn't a history tour." Several younger Marines joined in, their laughter spreading down the firing line like a gust of wind through dry grass. One private nudged another with his elbow while another quietly raised a phone, hoping to capture whatever came next. The range itself stretched nearly 600 yards beneath a bright blue sky. Steel targets shimmered in the afternoon heat. American flags marking wind direction fluttered unevenly, each one telling a slightly different story to trained eyes. The sharp scent of gun oil drifted through the air, mixing with sun-baked earth and freshly cut grass. Somewhere farther down the line, an instructor called commands with mechanical precision, but the words faded beneath the growing circle around the old veteran. Thomas never looked at the Marines laughing at him. His pale blue eyes remained fixed on the rifle rack behind Brooks. "I'd appreciate borrowing one," he said in a calm voice that carried no challenge and no apology. "Just for a few minutes." Brooks smirked wider. "Borrow one?" He shook his head in disbelief. These Marines qualify with these weapons every year. They're not souvenirs for retirees looking to relive old stories. More laughter erupted. Someone muttered, "Maybe he wants a picture for his grandkids." Another joked that the rifle probably weighed more than the old man. Thomas listened without reacting. His breathing never changed. His posture never stiffened. Silence had become an old companion decades earlier, and it fit him as naturally as the worn jacket resting across his shoulders. Brooks leaned forward onto the counter. "Tell you what," he said with exaggerated patience. "If you can remember the 4 safety rules without falling asleep, maybe we'll think about it." Even louder laughter rolled across the range. Yet Thomas only gave a faint smile, one so small it almost disappeared beneath the deep lines time had carved into his face. "I remember more than the rules," he answered softly. "I remember why they matter." The words were simple. There was no lecture in them. No attempt to impress anyone. Just quiet certainty. For a fraction of a second, one young lance corporal standing several yards away stopped smiling. Something about the old man's voice sounded familiar, not because he recognized the man, but because it carried the calm confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime earning every word before speaking it. Before he could think further, Brooks reached across the counter with another mocking grin, preparing to end the conversation once and for all, completely unaware that within minutes, one faded patch stitched onto an old jacket would silence an entire Marine rifle range. Corporal Ethan Brooks let his hand rest on the rifle rack, smiling with the relaxed confidence of someone who had never expected to be questioned inside his own range. He looked over his shoulder at the growing audience and shrugged theatrically. "See? This is exactly why civilians do not belong in restricted training areas." A few Marines nodded, eager to share the joke. One of them called out that they ought to issue the old man a wooden practice rifle from the museum instead. More laughter rolled across the firing line. Thomas Walker neither answered, nor turned away. He simply watched the rows of service rifles with the quiet attention of a man recognizing old friends after many years apart. His eyes lingered on every detail, from the neatly stacked magazines to the faint scratches along the black stocks left by thousands of training days beneath the Carolina sun. The silence surrounding him felt strangely different now. It was not the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence of patience. Brooks mistook it for defeat. "Sir," he continued, folding his arms again, "these Marines have spent months qualifying. Every weapon here is assigned, inspected, and maintained under strict accountability. We cannot just hand one over because somebody remembers the good old days. Thomas finally looked toward him. His expression remained gentle. I understand accountability, he replied. Probably better than you think. The answer was so calm that it almost sounded like simple conversation. But something about the words caused Lance Corporal Noah Carter to glance up from the ammunition table. Carter had arrived only minutes earlier after helping reset steel targets farther downrange. Unlike the others, he did not laugh. During his training at the Marine Corps Museum, instructors had repeated one lesson over and over. The quietest veterans often carried the deepest stories. He found himself studying the old man's posture instead of his age. Thomas stood balanced without leaning against the counter despite the long walk across the range. His hands remained relaxed, never fidgeting. His eyes moved naturally across the wind flags before briefly measuring the distance to the targets. None of it looked accidental. Brooks reached toward the equipment logbook. Name? He asked with exaggerated boredom. Thomas Walker. Brooks scribbled the name without caring whether it meant anything. Former occupation? Thomas smiled faintly. United States Marine. Several voices immediately answered with sarcastic whistles. One Marine muttered that everybody claimed to have been a Marine these days. Another joked that the stories always became bigger after retirement. Brooks chuckled. Well, Mr. Walker, every Marine remembers earning the title. That still does not qualify anybody to walk onto my firing line asking for a rifle. Thomas nodded once. Fair enough. The answer disappointed the crowd. They expected an argument. Instead, they found themselves facing a man completely untouched by their mockery. Carter noticed something else. As Thomas shifted slightly beneath the afternoon breeze, the edge of his faded jacket pulled back for only an instant. A worn olive cloth patch appeared near the shoulder seam before disappearing again beneath the fabric. It was weathered almost beyond recognition, its stitching faded by decades of sun and rain. Carter narrowed his eyes. He could not make out the emblem, only enough to recognize that it did not resemble any modern Marine insignia. Brooks saw the movement too, but his reaction was entirely different. A grin spread across his face as curiosity mixed with amusement. Hold on, he said, stepping around the counter. What exactly are you hiding under that old jacket? Around them, conversations faded once more. Even the rhythmic reports from distant firing lanes seemed to drift farther away as Brooks reached toward the veteran's shoulder with the careless confidence of someone convinced he was about to expose nothing more than another harmless old souvenir. Corporal Ethan Brooks did not hesitate. With a careless flick of his wrist, he pulled the edge of Thomas Walker's faded jacket aside just enough for the worn cloth beneath to catch the afternoon sunlight. A chorus of amused voices immediately followed. The patch was old. Its olive fabric had faded almost to gray, and the embroidered threads had softened after decades of weather, washing, and time. There was no polished emblem, no bright colors, no modern insignia that matched anything hanging inside the headquarters building. To the young Marines surrounding the equipment counter, it looked worthless. Brooks laughed first. That is what you have been protecting? He asked loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. I have seen better patches at surplus stores. Several Marines leaned closer, studying the weathered cloth before shaking their heads. One suggested it belonged to an old camping club. Another joked that somebody had probably sold it online for $20. Even the Marine holding the phone lowered it slightly, disappointed that the mysterious object looked so ordinary. Thomas never reached to cover it. He simply looked down at the faded stitching with an expression too quiet to describe as pride and too gentle to describe as sadness. It was the look of someone remembering people instead of possessions. Brooks noticed the silence and mistook it for surrender. Come on, he continued with a grin. At least tell us what secret organization this came from. Maybe we have all been standing next to a legendary superhero. More laughter drifted across the range. Thomas slowly lifted his eyes. It belonged to good Marines, he answered. That is enough. The simple reply somehow invited even more jokes. Good Marines? Brooks repeated. Every patch belongs to good Marines according to somebody. He reached out again, this time brushing 2 fingers across the faded embroidery as if testing whether it might peel away. The instant his hand touched the cloth, Thomas stopped looking at the firing line. The bright Carolina afternoon dissolved behind eyes that had watched too many distant horizons. The smell of fresh-cut grass quietly disappeared, replaced by the memory of damp earth after heavy rain. The steady breeze carrying the sound of steel targets became another wind entirely, one that whispered through towering trees while distant helicopter blades rolled across an overcast sky. Young voices vanished. In their place came the quiet rhythm of boots moving together with complete trust. Thomas remembered hands passing supplies without needing words. He remembered tired smiles shared around cooling coffee before sunrise. He remembered one Marine carefully sewing the very patch onto his shoulder while joking that every thread would outlast all of them. No medals had been present. No photographers. No speeches. Just a promise among men who believed service mattered more than recognition. The memory faded as gently as it had arrived. Thomas blinked once and found himself standing at the same equipment counter while Brooks still wore the same amused expression, completely unaware that he had touched something far more valuable than cloth. Across the firing line, Lance Corporal Noah Carter felt an unexpected chill despite the warm afternoon. He stared at the faded stitching, searching his memory. During a visit to the historical archives months earlier, an elderly curator had unlocked a display case containing photographs that were almost never shown to visitors. One image had included a weathered shoulder patch with an unusual border remarkably similar to the one now resting beneath Thomas Walker's jacket. Carter could not remember the unit's name, but he remembered the curator's final words perfectly. If you ever see one of those outside a museum, do not assume you are looking at fabric. You are looking at history. The laughter around him suddenly sounded much louder than it had only seconds before. The laughter slowly drifted back into ordinary conversation, but Lance Corporal Noah Carter could no longer hear most of it. His attention remained fixed on the weathered patch resting quietly against Thomas Walker's shoulder. The faded border, the uneven stitching, the almost invisible emblem worn smooth by decades. Every detail tugged at a memory that refused to stay buried. Carter stepped back from the crowd and slipped his phone from his pocket without drawing attention to himself. He did not point the camera at the old veteran. Instead, he opened the Marine Corps historical reference portal used during leadership courses and typed a simple description. Nothing appeared. He tried another combination of words. Still nothing. The database recognized modern units, ceremonial insignias, and retired command patches, but nothing resembled the faded cloth before him. That should have reassured him. Instead, it made him even more uneasy. The old curator's warning echoed inside his mind with uncomfortable clarity. Some insignias were intentionally absent from public records. Some histories survived only because a handful of people chose to remember them. Carter looked up again. Thomas had not moved. He still stood with the same relaxed posture, showing no concern for the whispers surrounding him. It struck Carter as unusual. Most people who had just been mocked by an entire firing line would either defend themselves or quietly leave. Thomas did neither. He simply waited, as though time had taught him that truth never needed to hurry. Corporal Ethan Brooks noticed Carter staring. "What is it now?" he asked with a grin. "Do not tell me you are trying to identify the world's oldest souvenir." A few Marines chuckled again. Carter forced a small smile, but it did not last. "I think I have seen something like it before," he answered carefully. Brooks laughed louder. "Then maybe your history instructor shops at the same flea market." The joke landed with everyone except Carter. He walked several yards away until the conversations became muffled beneath the steady breeze sweeping across the range. The American flags lining the distant firing lanes fluttered in different directions, revealing subtle shifts in the wind. Thomas noticed them without turning his head. Carter noticed something else. His own heartbeat seemed strangely loud. He opened the secure base directory and searched for the office responsible for historical lineage. His thumb hovered over the call button for several seconds. He hesitated. Reporting an old cloth patch sounded ridiculous. He imagined the questions he would receive. He imagined Brooks laughing for weeks if nothing came of it. Yet another memory surfaced. The curator had looked directly at every young Marine in the room before saying, "Respect history enough to ask questions before you dismiss it." Carter pressed the call button. The phone rang once. Twice. A calm administrative voice answered. Carter introduced himself, keeping his tone professional. He described the patch as accurately as he could without exaggeration. The voice on the other end grew noticeably quieter. "Stay where you are," the administrator finally said. "Do not speculate. Do not remove the patch." I need to verify something. The line disconnected before Carter could ask another question. He stared at the silent phone for a long moment. Back at the equipment counter, Brooks remained completely unaware of the conversation. He had already turned his attention toward entertaining the crowd again, confident that the afternoon belonged to him. Thomas simply watched the distant range flags dancing across the warm Carolina sky, his calm expression unchanged, while somewhere far beyond the firing line, a single phone inside headquarters began a chain of conversations that had not happened in decades. The waiting became the loudest sound on the range. Marines returned to their conversations, instructors resumed calling commands, and steel targets answered distant shots with sharp metallic echoes, yet an invisible thread of tension refused to break. Lance Corporal Noah Carter slipped his phone back into his pocket without saying a word about the call. The only instruction he had received had been simple. Stay where you are. Do not remove the patch. Someone will contact you shortly. Those words carried a weight he could not explain. Corporal Ethan Brooks noticed Carter's unusually serious expression and walked over with an amused smile. You actually called somebody, did not you? Carter hesitated before answering. I just wanted to check something. Brooks laughed. About that old patch? He looked back toward Thomas Walker, who remained standing quietly beside the equipment counter as though the passing minutes meant nothing at all. You are giving that jacket far too much credit. A few nearby Marines smiled, expecting Carter to admit he had overreacted. Instead, he simply looked toward Thomas again. The old veteran had not once asked for special treatment. He had not argued. He had not demanded respect. He had only asked to borrow a rifle. Somehow that simple request now felt far more important than it had a few minutes earlier. Thomas slowly lifted his eyes toward the distant firing lanes. The afternoon wind shifted again, causing the range flags to change direction almost together. Without thinking, he quietly said, Wind is moving left to right now. It will settle again in less than a minute. None of the Marines responded. Brooks merely smirked. 30 seconds later, the flags gradually relaxed, exactly as Thomas had predicted. One young private noticed first. He glanced at the flags, then back at the old veteran, uncertain whether it had been coincidence. Before he could say anything, Brooks waved dismissively. Lucky guess. Thomas offered no correction. He simply watched the horizon with the same calm expression. Carter found himself studying every small detail. Thomas never scanned the crowd nervously. He instinctively observed exits, vehicles, the wind, the spacing between people, and the condition of the range without appearing to move at all. It reminded Carter less of an elderly visitor and more of an instructor quietly evaluating an environment he already understood. Another minute passed. Then Carter's phone vibrated once. A short message appeared on the screen. It contained only a single sentence. Headquarters has initiated verification. Maintain observation until further instruction. Carter read the message twice before locking the screen. His pulse quickened. Verification. Not dismissal. Not correction. Verification. Whatever that faded patch represented, somebody inside headquarters had considered it important enough to investigate immediately. Brooks noticed the change in Carter's face. You are still taking this seriously? He asked. Carter answered honestly. I think somebody else is. Brooks shrugged with complete confidence. Then they are probably trying to figure out which military surplus store sold it. The surrounding Marines laughed again, but this time the sound felt thinner, almost uncertain. Doubt had quietly entered the circle. It spread not because anyone knew the truth, but because one Marine had stopped laughing. Another began looking at the patch more carefully. A third lowered his phone instead of recording. The atmosphere shifted almost as subtly as the changing wind across the range. Thomas sensed it without acknowledging it. He gently brushed a speck of dust from his sleeve, careful not to touch the faded patch itself. His fingertips paused for the briefest moment beside the worn stitching before falling naturally back to his side. There was no dramatic gesture, no emotional speech, only the quiet respect of a man remembering people who were no longer there. Far beyond the firing line, inside the headquarters building, another telephone began, ringing on the desk of an officer whose reaction would soon change the entire afternoon. Inside headquarters, the telephone rang only twice before it was answered. The duty officer expected another routine logistics request or a scheduling adjustment for the afternoon training cycle. Instead, He heard a calm, administrative voice from the historical lineage office asking a question that had not been asked in many years. "Can you confirm whether General Richard Hayes is still on base?" The officer frowned. "Yes, sir. He is finishing a command briefing." A brief silence followed. Then came the reply. "Interrupted." The duty officer sat upright. Interrupting a general's briefing was almost unheard of without an emergency. "May I ask the reason?" The answer arrived slowly, every word carefully chosen. "There is a veteran standing at Rifle Range 3 wearing a shoulder patch that should not exist outside official archives. We need visual confirmation immediately." The officer looked toward the conference room through the glass hallway, where senior officers continued discussing training schedules around a large screen filled with charts and operational reports. He hesitated for only a second before knocking firmly on the door. Inside, General Richard Hayes paused in the middle of a discussion and turned toward the interruption. The room fell silent. The duty officer stepped forward and quietly delivered the message. At first, Hayes simply listened without expression. Then he asked one question. "Describe the patch." The officer repeated every detail exactly as it had been reported. Worn olive fabric, faded border, nearly invisible insignia, civilian clothing, elderly Marine identifying himself as Thomas Walker. The room remained perfectly still. General Hayes slowly stood from his chair. His expression changed in a way that none of the officers present had ever witnessed. Surprise came first, then disbelief. Finally came something deeper, something that looked remarkably like respect. "Cancel the remainder of this briefing," he said quietly. No one argued. No one asked why. Hayes reached for his service cap before looking toward his executive aide. "Have transportation ready immediately." "Yes, sir." As the officers hurried into motion, one colonel cautiously asked, "Sir, is something wrong?" Hayes stopped beside the doorway. His eyes remained fixed somewhere beyond the building itself, as though looking across decades instead of miles. "If that description is accurate," he answered, "then an entire rifle range has been standing in the presence of history without realizing it." Back at Rifle Range 3, none of the Marines knew what had just begun. Corporal Ethan Brooks continued entertaining the small crowd gathered around the equipment counter. The jokes had become less frequent now, partly because they were running out of material and partly because Thomas Walker continued refusing to react. His composure made every attempt at ridicule feel strangely empty. Lance Corporal Noah Carter checked his silent phone again. Nothing. Yet the waiting itself seemed to carry growing significance. The afternoon sun drifted lower, casting longer shadows across the gravel and painting the rifle racks with warm golden light. A gentle breeze swept across the firing line once more, lifting the edge of Thomas's faded jacket just enough for the weathered patch to appear again. This time, almost nobody laughed. Several Marines simply looked at it in silence, as though seeing it for the first time. Thomas noticed their changing expressions, but said nothing. He folded his hands comfortably in front of him and watched a hawk circle high above the distant tree line. It was the same patient gaze of a man who had learned long ago that truth never needed to compete with noise. Far beyond the range entrance, the low sound of approaching engines began rolling across the base, unnoticed by most, but carrying with it the quiet certainty that the afternoon was about to change forever. The distant engines grew louder with every passing second until several Marines instinctively turned toward the entrance road. Two dark government vehicles rolled across the gravel at a steady pace, without flashing lights or unnecessary speed. They did not arrive with drama. They arrived with purpose. Conversations along the firing line slowly faded as instructors lowered their voices and range personnel exchanged puzzled glances. Visitors of any kind were uncommon during a qualification day. Senior command visits without prior notice were almost unheard of. Corporal Ethan Brooks straightened his posture, assuming the vehicles were stopping for a routine inspection. He quickly brushed dust from his sleeves and signaled the nearby Marines to look presentable. Thomas Walker remained exactly where he had been standing, his attention still resting on the distant range flags, as though the approaching convoy had nothing to do with him. Lance Corporal Noah Carter quietly recognized the lead vehicle before anyone else. He had seen it outside headquarters during command ceremonies. His pulse quickened. The rear door opened before the vehicles had fully settled. General Richard Hayes stepped onto the gravel with calm, deliberate movements, followed by his executive aide and 2 senior officers. The laughter that had filled the range only minutes earlier disappeared completely. Marines instinctively stood straighter. Commands that normally echoed across the firing line were replaced by complete silence. General Hayes acknowledged no one. He did not pause to greet the range officers waiting near the entrance. He did not ask for a briefing. Instead, his eyes moved across the gathering until they settled on a single figure standing quietly beside the equipment counter. Thomas Walker slowly turned as the breeze lifted the edge of his faded jacket once again. For a brief moment, the worn shoulder patch caught the afternoon sunlight. General Hayes stopped walking. His expression became unreadable. Brooks noticed the hesitation and assumed the general was simply confused by the unusual situation. Trying to be helpful, he stepped forward confidently. "Sir, this civilian requested access to a service rifle. We were explaining the regulations." Hayes raised one hand slightly without looking at Brooks. It was not an angry gesture. It was simply enough to end the explanation before another word could be spoken. Every Marine present immediately fell silent again. The general resumed walking, but much more slowly now. His eyes never left the faded patch. When he finally stopped a few feet in front of Thomas Walker, neither man spoke. The quiet seemed to stretch across the entire range. Even the steady breeze felt softer. Hayes studied the worn stitching with remarkable care, as though reading words invisible to everyone else. After several long seconds, he looked into Thomas's face. "May I?" he asked respectfully, gesturing toward the shoulder patch. Thomas gave a small nod. General Hayes carefully lifted only the edge of the faded jacket, never touching the patch itself. His eyes followed every weathered thread, every faded line, every mark left by decades of honest wear. He slowly released the fabric and stepped back. A faint smile crossed his face, not of amusement, but of recognition. "I was hoping I was mistaken," he said quietly. "Instead, I have been given the privilege of being right." Brooks exchanged confused looks with the other Marines. None of them understood what had just happened. Carter watched in complete silence, realizing that every instinct telling him to make the phone call had been correct. General Hayes turned toward the gathered Marines, his voice calm, but carrying effortlessly across the range. "Before another word is spoken," he said, "there is something every Marine standing here deserves to understand about the man wearing that patch." The entire firing line stood perfectly still, waiting for the truth that had remained hidden beneath faded cloth for longer than many of them had been alive. General Richard Hayes slowly turned toward the assembled Marines, allowing the silence to settle before he spoke again. "Most shoulder patches identify where someone served," he said in an even voice. "This one identifies a promise that was never meant for public recognition." Every eye returned to the weathered cloth resting against Thomas Walker's faded jacket. Under the warm afternoon sun, it looked almost ordinary, its colors softened by decades until only the careful stitching hinted that it had once been new. Hayes continued, "This insignia belonged to a provisional reconnaissance element that officially disappeared from records long before many of you were born. The men who wore it were never interested in attention. Their success depended on remaining unknown." The range remained perfectly still. Even Corporal Ethan Brooks forgot to breathe for a moment. The general looked at Thomas with unmistakable respect. Mr. Walker never asked for applause. He never asked anyone to remember his name. He simply came here today and politely requested to borrow a rifle. Those words landed far harder than any raised voice could have. Brooks lowered his eyes, replaying every joke he had made since the old veteran first approached the counter. General Hayes turned toward the equipment rack. "Corporal Brooks." "Yes, sir. Bring me the finest service rifle currently available for qualification." Brooks answered immediately. "Yes, sir." His confident tone had vanished, replaced by careful precision. He inspected each rifle with unusual attention before selecting one that had passed every inspection that morning. Carrying it with both hands, he walked back toward the general and stopped. Hayes accepted the rifle only long enough to inspect that it was clear and properly prepared. Then, instead of keeping it, he turned and presented it to Thomas Walker with both hands. It was not an official ceremony. There were no cameras from headquarters and no prepared remarks. Yet every Marine present understood they were witnessing an act of profound respect. Thomas accepted the rifle with gentle care, almost as though greeting an old friend after many years apart. He thanked the general with a quiet nod. Without rushing, he stepped onto the firing position. His movements were smooth, economical, and completely free of unnecessary motion. Younger Marines unconsciously leaned forward. There was nothing theatrical about the way he settled his feet or adjusted his shoulders. Every action appeared effortless because it had been practiced so many times that it had become instinct. Before raising the rifle, Thomas glanced once at the range flags dancing in the afternoon breeze. He closed his eyes for the briefest moment, feeling the wind against his face instead of staring at the fabric. When he opened them again, calm certainty had replaced every trace of age. He shouldered the rifle with quiet confidence, checked his sight picture, and allowed a slow breath to leave his lungs. The entire firing line watched without speaking. One carefully controlled shot echoed across the range. A heartbeat later, the distant steel target answered with a clear, unmistakable ring that carried back through the warm Carolina air. No one cheered. No one moved. The sound itself seemed enough. Thomas lowered the rifle just as calmly as he had raised it and handed it back with the same respect he had received. General Hayes accepted it with a slight smile before facing the Marines once more. "Skill fades if it is neglected," he said. "Character does not. What you witnessed today was not luck. It was the quiet discipline of a Marine who never stopped honoring the standards he learned long before most of us ever wore this uniform." For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The clear ring from the distant steel target seemed to linger in the warm afternoon air long after it had faded. The silence carried more weight than applause ever could. Corporal Ethan Brooks looked at the gravel beneath his boots, replaying every careless word he had spoken since Thomas Walker first approached the equipment counter. None of them sounded harmless anymore. They sounded small. He slowly stepped forward until he stood a respectful distance from the elderly Marine. "Mr. Walker," he said quietly, his voice stripped of every trace of pride, "I owe you an apology. I judged you before I knew anything about you. I forgot that the uniform is not the only thing that makes a Marine." Thomas looked at the young corporal with the same calm expression he had carried all afternoon. There was no satisfaction in his eyes, no desire to make anyone feel embarrassed. He simply offered a gentle smile. "We all make quick decisions when we are young," he answered. "The important part is deciding to become better afterward." Brooks nodded once, understanding that the lesson he would remember for the rest of his career had not come from a classroom or a training manual. Around them, one Marine after another quietly removed their covers. No command had been given. No order had been spoken. Respect spread naturally through the formation because every person present suddenly understood they had witnessed something larger than a rifle qualification. Lance Corporal Noah Carter watched the scene unfold with quiet gratitude. He realized that history had almost walked away unnoticed because it had arrived wearing faded denim instead of a dress uniform. General Richard Hayes stepped beside Thomas and extended his hand. Thomas accepted it with the firm, steady grip of a man whose strength had never depended on age alone. "Thank you for coming today," Hayes said sincerely. "These Marines will remember this afternoon far longer than they will remember any score on a qualification sheet." Thomas gave a small nod. "I did not come to teach a lesson," he replied. "I only wanted to hold a Marine rifle one more time." The honesty of that simple sentence settled over the range like the gentle breeze moving the flags above the firing lanes. There had been no hidden agenda, no attempt to prove anyone wrong. Only the quiet wish of an old Marine to reconnect, if only for a few minutes, with a part of his life that had never truly left him. General Hayes turned toward the formation. "Remember what happened here," he said. "One day you will meet people whose greatest achievements are invisible. Do not mistake humility for weakness, and never confuse worn clothing with an ordinary life." Every Marine stood silently as Thomas handed the rifle back one final time. He adjusted the edge of his faded jacket, covering the weathered patch once more. It disappeared beneath the old fabric exactly as it had remained hidden through countless years, never demanding attention, never asking to be admired. Thomas tipped his cap politely to the Marines and began walking toward the parking area with slow, measured steps. No one tried to stop him. No one rushed to surround him with questions. General Hayes remained standing at attention until the old veteran reached his truck and quietly drove away beneath the golden Carolina sky. Only after the vehicle disappeared beyond the trees did the general lower his salute. The range stayed silent for another moment, as though everyone understood that some stories deserve to end without another word. Some honors are stitched onto cloth, but the greatest ones are stitched into character, where time can never fade them.